Just want to welcome everyone here to our first podcast of Opening Day Sportsman. Here to talk about an issue that has still been on the hearts and minds of many Pennsylvania hunters was the changing of our opening date of deer season. And I have a gentleman with me, Mr. Dan DeVilla. And Dan, you can jump in here and introduce yourself, and we'll talk a little about who we are and why we're doing this.
Okay, welcome everybody. I got involved. I'm a Ohio resident. Let me start out with that. But I'm a lifelong hunter in Pennsylvania. I grew up in Pennsylvania in York. I also lived in Altoona, and I am a camp owner, but just a recent camp owner. So most of my adult hunting life has been a non-camp owner, and we're here obviously because we're in support of hunters against the Saturday opener. We want to see it restored back to Monday. So I got involved after I read an article by Randy on January 21st, and I did some investigating and reached out to him, and the article was in the Pennsylvania Game News, and our Pennsylvania Outdoor News, let me rephrase that, Pennsylvania Outdoor News, and was written very eloquently, and I agreed with everything he said, and I decided that I wanted to join forces with him to try to get this opener changed back to Monday. With that, I'll turn it back to Randy.
Thanks, Dan. The issue as it came to bear was something that had shocked me in many ways. My involvement in Pennsylvania in sporting aspects, just to let everybody know, kind of, like ask, well, who's Randy? Why is he so concerned about this? I was involved deeply in a lot of Pennsylvania upper end sporting issues regarding. I served on Governor Corbett's advisory council. I was president of a large statewide sportsman's group, which brought me into meet a lot of hunters over the state, local sporting, sportsman's clubs and so forth. And never in the entire time in my probably 50 years of hunting in Pennsylvania or more have I heard anyone want to change the opening day. It was something that was, it kind of caught me out in left field, as did many, many people in the state. And as this unfolded, the reasoning and the decision making I became involved in, viewing game commissioners, working group meetings, listening to their theories of the benefits of this. And this is the stuff today we want to share with the hunters of Pennsylvania, whether you're for the Saturday opener or against it. As a Pennsylvania sportsman, you need to hear how this went down. That was something that was not supported in any aspect, and it seemed to have a political push behind it. And we'll get into possibly at the end of this or the next podcast of the ramifications and the results. We'll touch on some of it today, but I think, as I stated, everybody needs to hear what wasn't in place and to make this decision. Like I said, Dan came to me, and as did hundreds, if not several hundred, that I have crossed paths with that are still total disagreement with this. And I can understand why, and I think hopefully a lot of people that listen today, it will help you understand why this was a bad decision. Dan, I don't know if you want anything at the onset here before I start to get into some of the details, and then you can chime in and I'll comment on those, obviously.
Okay. Well, and just to everybody listening to this podcast, we are not advocates of shortening or taking away two additional days of hunting. We just simply want to reallocate those days following the following Sundays, so now that Sunday's in. In addition to that, Randy and I don't really have an opinion one way or the other on a Sunday hunt. Okay, this is strictly about common sense We're going to talk about economic impact. Maybe not today, but in our next podcast, we'll get in more deeply in how it affected Pennsylvania Northern Tier company businesses, as well as some of the counties in the south where there's mountainous regions and those vendors and businesses really rely on the sportsmen that come into the woods and to the camp owners and so on and so forth. So just want to make sure everybody points this out. We're not advocating that we shorten your hunting season. We're simply saying they just missed the mark on making a change of what we characterize as the Super Bowl of hunting. In no other state in the United States does they have more hunters than us here in Pennsylvania on the opening day of anywhere in the history of hunting. I mean, we at one time we were approaching 1 million men, 1 million sportsmen, women and children, youth in the woods, and it's been declining. But changing this opener really isn't going to help benefit increasing hunting. If anything, we are going to show to everybody that it's going to have a reverse effect. And with that, I'll turn it back to Randy.
Yeah, we will get into the details of that, like Dan said, a little later on. But where this started was back in December 2017, the Board of Commissioners at the Game Commission, they have what's called a working group meeting prior to their general quarterly meeting. And the particular meeting here, it was when a lot of this discussion was begun, and it was implemented by a commissioner, which we'll identify here a little later on, who later on got away from it. He found out that the support wasn't there for this. And so what had happened was in December of 17, they had the commissioners had a basis of about 65% hunters opposing this from a hunter survey that was done in 2017. So they already kind of knew that there was a strong opposition in a lot of the hunting populace of Pennsylvania against this. That continued to go on where they were discussing this issue, and there was a lot of, let's call it disjointed comments referring to this. Well, it's just the old guys, which I found to be kind of an age discriminatory position, being that probably the average age of Pennsylvania hunters now is 57, 58 years old. So reaching for the youth, and we'll show later on how that didn't pan out. There was insults on our camp culture, which is let Dan elaborate on that, as we are the largest, Dan, as far as camp culture in the entire country. No other state carries the amount of hunters that hunt from summer homes, camps, as we do here in Pennsylvania. Now, sure, like everything, it's declined. We all know that. But still, camp hunters and traveling hunters can represent as much as 25 to 35% of our Pennsylvania hunting force. So, a big demographic there that you have to recognize when you make a decision that's going to affect them perhaps more so than other aspects. But that said, there's a lot of guys that don't hunt from camps are disagreeing with this also. The changing was done in that meeting. It almost sounded like they were trying to convince themselves, in spite of the opposition, that this was a good idea. There were comments made. I think Commissioner Foradora in the meeting was talking about the guys going to camps, and he actually made the comment that the camp guys just want to get there so they could sit around Saturday and party. I just was highly insulted by that as a Pennsylvania hunter. That's not a comment that should ever see the light of day. What we do at our camps, and the fact of there's a lot of hunters who go up here to scout, to have tradition unfold, cooking, fellowship, all of those things, and it got reduced to make us sound like a bunch of boozers. And now I'm starting to get upset because I could see where this was going. There was no reasonable discussion on the metrics of yes or no for the Saturday opener. So, Dan, do you want to jump in on anything on that aspect regarding their?
Well, when you said the metrics, there was no economic study done. They decided to put together a survey that they used a out of state company that actually does that for a living, and the questions were. Again, on another future podcast, we're not going to be able to cover everything. There's a lot of detail with what happened here, and a lot that went wrong, and a lot of damage that was done to the hunter population, as well as the business aspect of hunting. So they have a culture there at the Pennsylvania Game Commission that I'm just now starting to understand, and it really. I question whether or not the hunters really have a voice. When Randy and I went down there to do testimony in, I believe it was April, Randy, yeah, none of our comments were recorded, yet everything that they talked about was recorded, which is why we felt the podcast was necessary, because we do have such a large supporting group of individuals that would like to see it change back. And so with that, we're calling to task how this went down, the cast of players that were involved in it that Randy's going to touch on, which is really shocking, and really has nothing to do with hunters, or the license, the massive license purchasers, and the partners to the Pennsylvania Game Commission that sell the licenses were also hurt by this decision. So with that, Randy, go ahead and continue on.
Yeah, that the comment you made there, we found it interesting that you have a controlled environment where you have a meeting, quarterly meeting, commissioner meeting, that everything is live streamed except public comment. um, Very interesting. But moving outside of that, if anybody's sitting out there, well, what started this? Other than this meeting that came up that, and I mentioned earlier that a commissioner had started this, and the commissioner was from the Northwest. His name was Jim Daly. Commissioner Daly floated this out there, and it was interesting because on the onset of this, like I mentioned, the 65% hunter survey, of the contacts that came back into the agency prior to this change, 82% opposed it. So we had a hunter opinion in a survey. We had immediate contacts of 82% opposing, and this thing was starting to take form of something's wrong. And I happened to be at a meeting in Altoona that year, and we had about 265 hunters. This was regarding a group that was against the culling of the deer out in that area. They had legislators at this meeting. But I just took the opportunity, having an audience there of quite a few hunters, to ask the question. And the question was, how many in this group today support, or I think I started off, were against the Saturday deer opener? And out of that 265 hunters, 250 of them put their hands up. And of course, we asked the inverse of the question, and we saw 10 to 15 hands. So out of that particular, so the evidence was starting to build early on that this was not something that was favored by a majority of hunters. In fact, when I asked that question, I was quite stunned. Never thought it was going to be, 250 out of 265. So the commissioners came into the January meeting. They voted 8-0 to, this was before Jim Daly had changed his mind on this based on the evidence, but it was an 8-0 vote to move forward with this. Now, I found that to be interesting because they had a preliminary vote before any of their staff information was assessed. Now, that staff information was revealed in March of 2019. So just thought that preliminary vote was interesting. How do you vote on something when you don't even have your science presented to you yet? This was just basically the opinion of 8 people that I think 6 of the 8 had no camp involvement, so they couldn't even understood that portion of our hunting populace well enough to really make a decision. But that particular meeting, that one, the December meeting and into the January, there was a lot of speculation or speculative theories that the Board of Commissioners floated out there. This is going to be better. Why this? Why this? Why that? And some of them were just disproven completely after the first year that this transition, this change happened. And just so some of them, just to let you know, there were several. One was hunters that were new in the workforce, would not have seniority, vacation time, so forth and so on. Well, they surveyed the age group of 23 to, I think it was 36, somewhere in there, 23 to 36. Now, when I say they, this is Dr. Jagno from the Pennsylvania Game Commission staff. She came back with the numbers after the first Saturday opener that statewide, they only sold 12 more licenses in that age group. Now, can you think of a more representative age group of new hunters coming into the workforce than that age group? And they only sold 12 more licenses. So that aspect of there was some reason hunters weren't going to be able to take off because of work or didn't make the effort or was disproven on that theory. There were other aspects of this that were floated out there. College students. The commissioners decided that this was going to be more beneficial for college students home for Thanksgiving, and they were going to have time to go hunting. And well, Dr. Jagno, again, who was tasked with surveying all of these theories, came back with her position from her survey science that of 4 potential Saturdays or opening day scenarios, the majority of the college students that she surveyed supported staying with the Monday opener. So found that to be quite stunning as far as against the board's position. And she kind of finished with a comment. She told them that the college students basically said they would miss class for a lot less reasons than the opening day of deer season. So making this change again, position number 2, for it being some kind of influence or positive thing for the college end of things, didn't pan out. So over and over and over again, we started seeing issues in the presentation after the first Saturday opener that this thing was not panning out. If I take a step back, as we were started here with the reasons, the metrics that weren't assessed or ignored, the commissioners got through this meeting. And at one point, Commissioner Jim Daly, who had initiated this, astutely looked at the evidence flowing in, staff reports, hunter comments, surveys, everything. And he reversed his position. And he went back to the other board members and wrote each one of them a letter, contacted them and said, gentlemen, doesn't look like this was the right thing to do. And that commissioner, Jim Daly, who, to his credit, he resigned from the Board of Commissioners. And Jim's comment, to paraphrase, was, I cannot serve on a board that cannot assess evidence in front of them and come to the correct decision. So Commissioner Daly resigned his position on the board because of everything pointing in one direction and the board voting the other. So that I thought was a highly commendable thing from that person, to start something, assess the information, reverse his position based on that information. And unfortunately, the rest of the board didn't. And there are other parameters here that I think is a reason why, and we're going to get into that here in a bit.
And let me just jump in here for a second, and that, in that he reversed his position based upon the Pennsylvania Game Commission's own survey. And then they turn around and do another survey with weighted questions. And everybody that knows about surveys, you can manipulate the questions in a manner of which that you will get an intended result favorably to your position. And in addition to that, there were outside influences that came into bear, which now we brought in politics with Daniel Laughlin weighing in, and a few other people, commissioners themselves, that said, "Well, geez, my grandsons will like this," and that they were doing it for selfish reasons. And I think one of the commissioners actually said selfish reasons that he would.
He did. I think that was, and I believe that was Commissioner Foradora brought that up also. That I made that comment. I have a personal aspect here. When we get into the politics of this, and a lot of hunters don't want to mix politics with game management. So let's be clear of one thing. Maybe we didn't mention yet, was the Game Commission themselves identified this change as strictly a social aspect. This had nothing to do with deer management, had nothing to do with biological aspects of deer management. This was a shoot from the hip social change. So I've heard hunters out there saying, well, we should leave the deer management to them. No, this wasn't deer management, gentlemen. This was, and ladies, this was something that was perpetrated with an agenda. As this thing got voted on, the final vote was 5-3. So in other words, 3 commissioners had changed their minds because of what was happening. So it went from 8-0 before the evidence was assessed to 5-3. And when that happened, the 2 chairmen of the House Game and Fisheries at that time, which was Representative Bill Courts and Representative Keith Gillespie, because of all of the pressure that they were receiving from their constituents, they summoned the Board of Commissioners, the Game Commission Board of Commissioners, this has never been done before in my knowledge, back to Harrisburg to have a meeting for them to reconsider their vote. The board came back to Harrisburg. They would not change their mind, and they agreed upon a 3-year look back to assess this change. That was the best that the board, the commissioners, could get out of the Game Commission board. That particular 3-year look back, which we'll talk at length probably in the second podcast, but the 3-year look back came and went. And first off, Bill Courts had retired. The date came for the commissioners to assess this. They did not have a working quorum appointed on their board, so they could not hold a meeting to make any changes to seasons or bag limits.
Randy, explain the quorum to everybody.
Well, the Board of Commissioners has to have, I believe, 5 at that time seated commissioners to hold a voting meeting to make changes to anything on seasons and bag limits. Now, that comes about from kind of the Governor's Advisory Council not keeping these seats occupied. So they came to the 3rd year, and the approval process had not followed through for 3 of the commissioners. So when the meeting date came, they could do nothing more than pass through the seasons and bag limits through to this season. So the 3rd year anniversary, which was supposed to be an assessment of the Saturday opener, didn't happen. Representative Gillespie, who now has also been voted out of office, could have requested a special meeting after the quorum was in place several weeks later to address this. He didn't do it. He didn't care to bring this thing back and follow through on his initial agreement with the board. So here we are now going into the 4th year without that assessment that was promised back at the initial vote on this thing back in 2019, I believe it was, the first vote. So politics, step 1. Dan, you brought up probably, let's call it politics, step 2 on this decision, which you mentioned Senator Laughlin. I was at the meeting where the Senator Laughlin came to support the vote. for this, and I believe it was the early 2019 meeting in April.
Randy, before you get into what he did at that meeting, why don't you explain to our viewers what Daniel Laughlin's position is and what boards that he chairs and so on and so forth?
Yeah, the commissioner selection process for the Game Commission is a slightly involved process with interviews and so forth, and it comes to a final approval vote, and it has to be a majority vote from the Pennsylvania Senate. Senator Laughlin, at that time and still is, the Republican seated chairman of the Senate Game and Fisheries Committee. So his position as a seated senator, not only as a senator, but as a chair of the Senate Game and Fisheries Committee, adds a particular impact for his aspect of showing up at the agency to address the board. So what this means is you have a board of commissioners sitting there who their appointment or reappointment, because they have to be reappointed every 4 years, is based on a approval through the Senate. Now, here is a senator who obviously wields a lot of influence in that majority vote with a lot of legislators that may not know much about hunting. They would obviously come to a legislator that does. And Senator Laughlin is there professing an opinion to influence the board for his personal aspects of talking about being able to hunt with his college-age children. So his personal position on this was being brought into this, and him being in the position he is in of the involvement in the commissioner selection process, I thought was highly unethical. And as I was stating to the hunters today early on, you need to hear this stuff, and so that you can start to understand how this went down, and some of the things that were brought in that had no place being in the decision-making process of this. And there was a lot of things that should have been brought in that weren't. And Dan, you could probably bring that in a little bit as far as, the the aspect of the parameters that weren't addressed in this. Not only the hunter opinion, economic impacts, traditions, family, traditional aspects around Thanksgiving. There was a bundle of things that were not adequately vetted to make this decision, and subsequently, this is why we feel it's a wrong decision, and it's been damaging, and we're going to start to show how it has been. Dan, do you have anything else you want to add to the early aspects of this regarding the voting or the? I guess I do have more here if you that I can tap on, and I think.
Oh no, I think keep on going. I mean, let's face it. You and I both know you can't move. Let's just talk about Saturday. What Saturday represents for Pennsylvania. Number one, the deer season is really wrapped around. It's the only season that we have that's around a national holiday, which is Thanksgiving. It's family time. For all those that there's a lot of planning that goes into deer hunting, rifle deer hunting, and there's usually a fair amount of travel involved in it as well. You can't move 650 to 750,000 hunters from one day to another day without having tremendous impact to the economic stimulus of the state. And by moving it to Saturday, they effectively went against the governor's own position of small business Saturday. You had Black Friday and small business Saturday, and then, of course, you had Cyber Monday. So it was a very, in as much as, well, what does that have to do with hunters? Well, it has a lot to do with hunters. And in addition to that, this particular deal that they slammed through then was impacted by the COVID. So these poor business owners in the northern tier not only had to endure, and first responders, their number, we already know that with the surveys that you and I have conducted, that that was the number one fundraising day of the year. and now that is gone. The hunters they're in the woods. It's a mad rush to get there. If you got to put a tree stand up, good luck with that. Any scouting or shooting in rifles or mentoring the youth that are in your group at the range for sighting in rifles and stuff like that. Those things are all gone. Those were all part of the tradition of leading up to a Monday opener. So those are all damaged, as well as we're going to be able to get to in later podcasts the dollar amount that was affected by this, and just the
Yeah. Um, Dan froze up here a bit. We'll see if that corrects itself. But to to elaborate on what Dan was saying regarding those days, the Friday for the northern tier businesses, the amount of hunters that traveled into these small towns was an enormous boost for these businesses. Um, Dan bounced out here. We'll see if we can get him back, but I can continue to explain this. These businesses, I recognized this impact as soon as this decision was going to be made. And I saw that the Game Commission did nothing, had no concern about this. So I did a little bit of, looking into this myself. But you've taken away Black Friday from these businesses, which, if those of you know what Black Friday means, it's so significant that it can bring a business's bottom line from the red into the black. That's why it's named Black Friday. Saturday, like Dan mentioned, Small Business Saturday, we steered 500,000 or more hunters into the woods on a day that was supposed to be set aside for patronizing small businesses, which hurt that initiative. So you see the economic side of this thing was completely ignored. Now the entirety of this thing was something that was translated out into a lot of lost money. Dan mentioned about the first responders, nonprofits. They utilized that weekend because of the high influx of hunters to have fundraising events. And with the Saturday opener, it has become a mad rush to finish up Thanksgiving. You have Friday to do everything, and if you know that time of year, Saturday, the daylight on that time of year is pretty short to begin with. So you end up traveling, trying to open a camp, or trying to button up everything that you perhaps should have done earlier if you procrastinated a bit about. You ended up having a situation where it did a lot of damage on the economic side, as well as the family side of this thing. What we're going to do here, and this is actually Dan and I's first podcast. For some reason, I don't know why he dropped out. Of course, this is a little bit of a learning curve for us. I think what we're going to do is leave this at this point now, and we'll bring in we'll start a second podcast, and we'll pick this up from some of the aspects of, bring up some more of the reasoning that was against this. We can discuss economics. We can also discuss the political side of this some more, and the ultimate aspects of how hunting licenses unfolded in this 3-year test period. Those aspects are things that all, again, point to this not being a good decision of changing this opening day. And just keep in mind, for anybody sitting out there thinking, well, this is going into the 4th year, and we can't change it now. Let me remind you, the Monday opener was 60 years plus and highly successful, and it got changed. So let's start looking further into the details of this thing and let all our sportsmen and our legislators know, again, why this was a bad decision. Our group that Dan and I have gotten involved together, we've started a coalition. We circulated some information across the state. We currently have about 1,500 email contacts from sportsmen and sportswomen that are against the Saturday opener. We have a Facebook page, which is Pennsylvania Hunters Against the Saturday Opener, Deer Opener. We're probably around 965 members in that currently, and we're going to continue on with this coalition and this movement. So we'll put the information out on the where this podcast is in future ones to those 1,500 emails through a link, and we'll start spreading the word with everyone that's interested in hearing this and hearing how this unfolded after this thing was implemented. But thank you, everyone, for being on board, and we're going to figure what the technical difficulty is here and get that worked out. But thank you much. Take care.